What if the foundations of today's financial world were not built by industry, innovation, or progress, but by a family whose rise began with fraud so subtle and structured that most people never even realized it was happening? Before the celebrated industrial barons shaped modern capitalism, there was a quieter force operating in the shadows, turning deception into a long-lasting form of economic influence. The deeper you look into these early patterns, the clearer it becomes that the financial system we trust today evolved from mechanisms designed not for stability, but for control. In those early centuries, when empires negotiated power through land, grain, and gold, this family understood something that others did not. They realized that money is not just currency. It is information. It is leverage. It is perception. And whoever controls the perception controls the flow. Instead of relying on brute force or inherited privilege, they created a method of manipulating scarcity, distributing trust, and extracting value through carefully crafted illusions that shaped entire markets long before the era of factories and steel. These early schemes were not crude tricks. They were the prototypes of financial engineering. They exploited asymmetric knowledge, political vulnerability, and the absence of regulatory oversight. They redefined value by redefining what people believed value was. And every time society thought it had discovered a new economic era, these hidden architects were already steps ahead, rewriting the rules from behind closed doors. The echoes of that strategy still ripple today through modern banking, sovereign debt structures, currency manipulation, and the invisible networks that decide who thrives and who collapses. This story is not just about fraud. It is about design, control, power, evolving through generations. And as you start connecting the historical signs, you may even notice parallels with crises you have lived through. Have you ever felt that financial disasters seem too coordinated to be random? That someone always appears to benefit when everyone else loses? What you're about to uncover may shift the way you see the entire financial landscape. Before we continue, share your thoughts in the comments and tell me if you have ever questioned the origins of the systems we depend on. Your perspective matters here. Also, take a moment to like this video and check if you are already subscribed, because understanding this kind of content can redefine how you interpret what happens next in the global economy. And now, as we move forward, the next layer of this hidden structure begins to reveal itself in unexpected ways, expanding the trail we started uncovering. As the early structures of influence expanded, the mechanisms this family created began to operate with a precision that looked nothing like the crude economic exchanges of their time. They recognized that true power did not lie in accumulating wealth, but in orchestrating the movement of wealth around them. Their strategy relied on an understanding of human behavior that was far ahead of its era. People respond not to what is real, but to what they believe is real. And if you could shape belief, you could shape markets long before the existence of modern financial institutions. They mastered the art of creating controlled shortages, manipulating expectations, and using carefully timed releases of information to tilt entire regions in their favor. While merchants focused on goods, they focused on narratives. While rulers focused on armies, they focused on influence. And while societies believed they were operating freely, they were unknowingly responding to signals designed to guide their decisions. These early methods were the blueprint for what would later become market speculation, inflation cycles, and credit manipulation. Their first major breakthrough came when they realized that uncertainty was a more powerful tool than certainty. If people could be made to fear a coming scarcity, prices could be pushed upward without moving a single physical resource. If rumor suggested an oversupply, values could collapse even when nothing had changed in reality. By controlling whispers, patterns, and timing, they controlled the perception of risk. And whoever controls risk controls the choices of others. This family did not need to own everything. They only needed to influence enough to reposition the flow. They positioned themselves as indispensable intermediaries, offering stability in moments they had quietly helped destabilize. They understood that chaos is not a threat when you are the one designing its direction. Their operations began small, affecting local markets and regional trade networks, but the principles behind their actions were scalable, adaptable, and deceptively simple. Each generation refined the process, turning improvised tactics into a structured art. And beneath these maneuvers was an unspoken lesson. Economies are far easier to manipulate when participants believe they are acting independently. The invisibility of influence was their greatest advantage. It allowed them to shape outcomes without appearing responsible for the consequences. And the more invisible the mechanism, the stronger it became, because no one was looking in the right place. These patterns, once dismissed as coincidence or misfortune, would soon evolve into instruments capable of bending entire economies through anticipation alone. As their methods matured, they discovered something even more powerful than scarcity or rumor, something that would quietly redefine economic behavior for centuries. It was not a commodity or currency, but a psychological lever capable of shifting entire societies without force. What they uncovered next was the realization that confidence itself could be weaponized, engineered, and redistributed like a currency, long before economists defined trust as the backbone of any financial system. This family had already learned how to manufacture it, distort it, and withdraw it at will. They understood that when people believe in stability, they invest, trade, and expand. When they believe collapse is near, they hoard, sell, and retreat. Confidence became the invisible hinge controlling every market reaction, and they positioned themselves as the quiet hands pushing that hinge in whichever direction best served their interests. To exploit the psychological force, they began structuring a network of intermediaries who appeared independent but were actually aligned with their goals. These individuals became the unofficial broadcasters of certainty or panic. A merchant respected for reliability might suddenly warn of a failing harvest. A scholar might present calculations suggesting an economic downturn. A regional lender might tighten credit under the guise of prudence. Each voice was seemingly autonomous, yet all were pieces of a coordinated design meant to push public sentiment exactly where the family intended. Their strategy evolved further with the strategic placement of loans, arbitrated disputes, and selective backing of rulers or trading houses. By deciding who received resources and who did not, they created dependencies that spread across borders. A city-state might flourish or fall based on the credit they extended or withheld. A rising power could be stabilized with well-timed financial support or quietly sabotaged through subtle strains on liquidity. Their influence expanded not through visible ownership, but through the delicate architecture of trust cycles, placing them at the center of decisions that shaped economies from within. What made these mechanisms so effective was their concealment behind recognizable patterns. To the public, rising prices appeared linked to shortages or political tensions. Collapses seemed like the natural result of mismanagement or misfortune. Prosperity looked like the outcome of hard work and competent leadership. Yet beneath the surface, the signals driving these movements originated from a single source. Through the precise orchestration of confidence, the family built a system where they no longer needed to manipulate physical goods or even information directly. They only had to influence how people interpreted what was already happening. As these techniques became embedded in trade networks and governance structures, they began to form something resembling a prototypical financial ecosystem. A system in which perception held more weight than reality, and where a small, coordinated group could shift the direction of entire markets without leaving evidence of interference. It was within this emerging environment that the next evolution of their strategy would take shape, a transformation that would blur the boundary between manipulation and institutional power, preparing the ground for a form of influence far more pervasive than anything they had constructed before. As their influence expanded beyond merchants, rulers, and regional lenders, something far more profound began to unfold. The family realized that controlling confidence was only one layer of the structure they were building. The next step was to turn their methods into something resembling authority, a form of power that appeared legitimate even though it emerged from manipulation. To achieve this, they embedded themselves into political and administrative systems, not as conquerors or monarchs, but as indispensable advisors whose financial insight seemed to illuminate patterns no one else could see. Leaders trusted them because they predicted crises before they happened, stabilized conflicts before they erupted, and offered solutions that appeared almost prophetic. What no one understood was that these predictions were not insights into the future. They were the results of systems the family had already set in motion. Their influence became self-reinforcing. When a ruler acted on their warnings, it shaped the outcome exactly as forecast. When they recommended a trade policy, the very networks they controlled quietly pushed events to match the anticipated direction. Over time, their involvement became normalized. Courts, councils, and entire administrations began consulting them during moments of uncertainty, unaware that the uncertainty itself had been carefully cultivated. The turning point came when they developed a method for mediating disputes between rival factions, cities, and even nations. By positioning themselves as neutral arbiters, they gained visibility and prestige. But more importantly, they gained access to sensitive information. They learned who owed what, who feared what, who depended on whom. This intelligence gave them unprecedented leverage. They could shift alliances by controlling access to credit, tilt negotiations by leaking selective insights through loyal intermediaries, and steer treaties by influencing the perceived risks of war or peace. It was during these years that their power took on a new dimension. They were no longer manipulating markets from the outside. They were shaping policy from within. But this integration had a consequence they understood better than anyone else. Once power becomes institutional, it requires protection. And so they refined their operations, crafting layers of plausible deniability, obscured records, and networks of agency whose identities rarely intersected. Influence became a structure rather than a tactic, a system capable of expanding without exposing its architects. In this phase, the family demonstrated a truth that would echo through centuries of financial history. Institutions can be manipulated more subtly than markets because institutions rely on trust, hierarchy, and the illusion of order. Once embedded in those structures, they could pull the same levers of scarcity, confidence, and narrative. Control, but with far greater impact, shaping the destiny of entire regions under the guise of expertise. Share in the comments what you think about this kind of hidden institutional influence. Does it surprise you how subtle power can become when it is embedded inside systems people believe are stable and fair? As their presence inside political and administrative structures solidified, the family recognized an opportunity far greater than influencing individual policies or regional disputes. They saw that the true source of long-term dominance would not come from manipulating isolated markets, but from shaping the very systems that defined value. If they could influence how money itself was created, distributed, and controlled, they would no longer need to adjust events from the shadows. The world would simply move according to principles they engineered generations earlier. Their first major step toward this transformation involved the gradual transition from commodity-backed wealth to abstract forms of credit and promissory exchange. At a time when most societies still believed economic stability depended on tangible reserves of gold, grain, or land, the family promoted instruments that existed only on paper. These early notes carried their seal, their authority, and eventually their reputation. People accepted them not because they understood their mechanics, but because they trusted the family behind them. And with every transaction conducted through these instruments, dependence deepened, making the family's influence an inseparable part of daily economic life. As the system evolved, they realized that controlling perception of value allowed them to control value itself. A resource did not need to be scarce to be priced as rare. A currency did not need to collapse to lose credibility. By directing confidence toward or away from specific forms of money, they shaped economic behavior without altering physical assets. Governments that once relied on material reserves now found themselves indebted to networks that extended credit according to criteria invisible to the public. The family learned to tighten or loosen liquidity with extraordinary precision, using subtle restrictions, delayed shipments, or carefully crafted narratives that influenced public sentiment and political priorities. What emerged was a primitive yet powerful version of a monetary system driven not by resources, but by agreements, expectations, and dependencies. This system allowed the family to extend influence across borders without armies, without explicit authority, and without public acknowledgement. Their methods were scalable because they no longer relied on local conditions. A financial instrument created in one region could bind another thousands of miles away. Debt became a tool not for transaction, but for control. A ruler indebted to them became predictable. A city dependent on their credit became compliant. A rival weakened by liquidity. Constraints became vulnerable. The brilliance of this transition was in its invisibility. People believed the system was evolving naturally as trade expanded. Leaders believed they were adopting modern financial practices. Yet the core mechanics guiding these changes originated from a single lineage, quietly embedding its logic into every agreement, every ledger, every circulation of credit. And as commerce grew more complex, the family discovered that the greatest power lay not in issuing value, but in determining which form of value societies would depend on next, setting the stage for a transition that would redefine economies for centuries. As their credit-based structures expanded across regions and rulers, the family understood that influence over money was only the first layer of what could become a vast architecture of control. The next evolution required them to shape the institutions that mediated economic life, embedding their logic so deeply that future generations would accept it as the natural order of finance. To do this, they began constructing frameworks that resembled early versions of banks, not in the modern sense of grand buildings and regulated systems, but as interconnected hubs where information, trust, and leverage converged under their supervision. These early institutions operated quietly, often disguised as trading houses, mediation councils, or administrative offices. On the surface, they provided stability, resolving disputes, storing wealth, and facilitating transactions between increasingly distant markets. But beneath that surface, they served as the central nervous system of the family's strategy. Every ledger they maintained revealed patterns of behavior. Every recorded debt exposed vulnerabilities. Every stored asset represented a future opportunity. Knowledge became their most valuable resource, and the institutions they built became the channels through which that knowledge flowed. Over time, these hubs began to accumulate authority. Merchants relied on them for credit evaluations. Rulers depended on them for assessments of economic health. Even rival factions accepted their involvement because the family had positioned these institutions as neutral, reliable, and essential. Yet neutrality was the illusion that made everything work. By selectively guiding the flow of information, the family shaped not only the decisions people made, but also the choices they believed were available. They determined which cities were seen as stable, which currencies were considered trustworthy, and which debts were likely to be repaid. As their influence grew, these institutions started to resemble something far more sophisticated than the family had initially designed. They became prototypes for systems that would one day define the frameworks of global finance. Concepts such as standardized accounting, risk evaluation, controlled lending, and regulated exchange did not emerge spontaneously. They were shaped, tested, and refined within these early structures, often decades before the rest of the world understood their significance. And because these principles were rooted in manipulation of perception and dependency, they carried the family's logic into every region where the institutions expanded. What made this evolution so powerful was its permanence. Markets fluctuate, rulers rise and fall, wars reshape borders, but institutions endure. Once embedded, their rules become tradition, their methods become law, and their influence survives the individuals who created them. By constructing institutions, rather than relying solely on tactics, the family ensured that their power would continue, even if their name disappeared from public memory. The system itself would carry forward their strategies, replicating the same patterns of control across generations. And with these institutions firmly in place, the family prepared to make a leap that would fundamentally reshape the balance between society, power, and economic stability, deepening their influence in ways the world had never before experienced. As the institutions they crafted grew roots across regions, something even more significant began to unfold. The family realized that their influence no longer depended solely on economic manipulation or strategic credit allocation. Their power had become embedded in the social fabric itself. Markets were reacting to signals shaped through their institutions. Rulers were leaning on their assessments, and merchants were following the trends they subtly guided. Influence had transformed into an ecosystem, and within that ecosystem, the family could reshape entire societies without needing to appear anywhere near the center of events. This new phase began when they recognized a recurring pattern in every crisis that emerged. Whether triggered by conflict, scarcity, or political instability, crises revealed a simple truth. People seek anchors when uncertainty rises. And because their institutions were positioned as stable, credible, and necessary, they became the natural anchor for every collapse they had helped precipitate. In moments of turmoil, their influence expanded more rapidly than during periods of prosperity. Every downturn strengthened their grip, reinforcing the perception that they were the only reliable constant in a world shifting beneath everyone's feet. This dynamic produced waves of dependence across entire populations. Cities reorganized trade routes to stay aligned with their networks. Rulers restructured their treasuries according to the family's recommended metrics. Even cultural norms began to change as societies adapted to systems rooted in perception rather than material wealth. Debts became moral obligations. Credit became a measure of character. Trust became a political currency. And at the center of all these transformations was the quiet architecture designed by a lineage that understood the human mind. Long before governments understood economics, over time, these patterns created stratified social structures that mirrored the family's financial hierarchy. Those aligned with their institutions prospered. Those outside them became vulnerable. Entire classes emerged based not on birth or military power, but on access to liquidity, stability, and the invisible networks the family controlled. The influence that had begun with whispered rumors and controlled shortages had evolved into a form of societal engineering, shaping who advanced, who fell behind, and who remained forever dependent on a system they never fully understood. It was in this period that the family achieved something resembling absolute power, not through force, but through inevitability. People no longer questioned why certain decisions were made. They accepted the system as the natural order of the world. The family no longer needed to intervene directly. The structures they had built now produced the outcomes they desired automatically. And with each generation, these patterns became more entrenched, setting the stage for institutions that would later be mistaken for organic elements of civilization, rather than engineered instruments of influence. Share in the comments what you think about a system where power spreads not through war or conquest, but through quiet, deeply embedded structures that shape society from the inside out. Does this kind of influence feel more dangerous because of how invisible it becomes? As the social structures molded by the family solidified, their influence began to intersect with forces far larger than local markets or regional politics. They had laid the foundations of a system capable of directing human behavior, but the next evolution would connect their strategies to something far more cyclical and far-reaching, the recurrent waves of economic rise and collapse that came to define entire eras. While most societies viewed these crises as natural fluctuations or unfortunate coincidences, The family recognized them as opportunities built into the very architecture they had designed. With each cycle, they refined their mastery, aligning their actions with predictable patterns that echoed across generations. These cycles began with subtle signals. Liquidity would tighten in specific regions. Promissory networks would strain under invisible pressures. Rumors of shortages, though unconfirmed, would circulate among merchants. And slowly, these tensions would grow into broader instability. But what appeared to be spontaneous cracks in the system were the result of carefully placed stress points, inserted long before the public ever sensed trouble. The family understood that a crisis creates confusion, and confusion creates openings for those who already know the direction events will take. They positioned themselves to benefit not from stability, but from the controlled unraveling of structures they had quietly shaped. During these downturns, their institutions became indispensable. Rulers sought their assessments to understand collapsing trade routes. Merchants depended on their credit to survive sudden contractions. Populations turned to their proxies for explanations, not realizing that the narrative was being scripted by the same forces directing the collapse. Each crisis reinforced the belief that the system needed their guidance, deepening reliance on the frameworks they had embedded into the economic landscape. This dynamic created cycles where they accumulated assets, influence, and political leverage at moments when others were losing everything. What made these cycles particularly effective was their global resonance. Long before the concept of global markets existed, the family linked distant regions through debt chains, trade agreements, and interdependent flows of credit. This allowed them to trigger ripple effects across borders, turning local disturbances into international crises. A shortage engineered in a dynasty, one region could devalue currencies in another. A tightening of credit in one port could destabilize an entire trade network. And because they controlled the underlying mechanisms, they could predict outcomes with remarkable accuracy, positioning themselves to rise even as others fell. These recurring patterns shaped not only economies, but the political landscape itself. Rulers who survived crises often owed their stability to the family's intervention, while those who collapsed became cautionary examples reinforcing the family's reputation as indispensable. Over time, these cycles created a narrative in which the family appeared to be the guardians of order, rather than the architects of disruption. Each downturn subtly reshaped power dynamics, elevating their influence while weakening traditional authorities. As the world unknowingly adapted to these repeated patterns, the family saw an even greater opportunity emerging. The cycles they exploited were becoming more predictable, more integrated, and more capable of transforming entire eras with a single coordinated shift. And within this growing complexity, they identified the next step that would bind every future crisis, every recovery, and every economic transformation to a system of control more deeply rooted than anything they had previously engineered. As the cycles of engineered instability became more synchronized, the family began to observe something profound. The patterns they had cultivated were no longer isolated mechanisms, but interconnected forces capable of steering entire civilizations. Through centuries of refinement, the same foundational tactics they once used to influence local markets had evolved into global principles that shaped currency behavior, debt dependence, political vulnerability, and societal expectations. These patterns were not visible to the public, not taught in schools, and not acknowledged by leaders, yet they defined the movement of wealth and the distribution of power across generations. One of the most significant patterns involved the strategic manipulation of confidence at scale. What began as whispered rumors among merchants had transformed into broad psychological waves affecting entire regions. The family understood that markets respond less to reality and more to anticipation. A well-timed suggestion of economic fragility could trigger defensive measures across kingdoms. A fabricated sense of prosperity could push populations toward reckless expansion. Over time, this manipulation became so embedded that financial systems began to react automatically to signals that mirrored the family's original designs. Even without direct intervention, their logic had become the default setting of economic behavior. Another hidden pattern lay in the transition from material wealth to abstract financial structures. The family had spent generations reducing dependence on physical commodities, replacing them with systems of credit, valuation, and risk that only they fully understood. This evolution allowed them to influence governments without occupying any official role. A king with empty reserves could still wage war if granted credit through the family's networks. A city with overflowing wealth could collapse if its liquidity was quietly constricted. The more abstract the system became, the easier it was to manipulate from afar, turning distance into advantage rather than limitation. Debt was perhaps the most powerful of these patterns. By transforming debt from a temporary obligation into a foundational pillar of economic life, the family ensured perpetual leverage. Rulers inherited debt structures they could never fully repay. Populations lived within systems where borrowing became essential for survival. Whole regions adapted their policies to satisfy creditors they had never met. Debt ceased to be a tool of necessity and became a mechanism of control, binding the destinies of entire societies to choices made by a lineage that remained hidden behind institutional facades. These patterns extended even further, shaping geopolitical tensions, trade alliances, and ideological conflicts. The family learned that by controlling the financial incentives behind political decisions, they could indirectly control the decisions themselves. A treaty could be influenced through the promise of stability. A rivalry could be inflamed through selective tightening of resources. A reform could be derailed through a manufactured crisis. And because these interventions appeared to be the natural consequences of complex global dynamics, no one questioned the invisible hand guiding them. By the time the modern world began to form, the family's fingerprints were embedded so deeply into economic structures that even decades of reform, revolution, and innovation could not erase their influence. The system itself had internalized their logic, perpetuating the same cycles, dependencies, and hierarchies they had crafted centuries earlier. And yet, the most significant transformation was still ahead, a shift that would bind these hidden patterns to the financial behavior of every nation, institution, and individual in the world. As the world entered the threshold of modern finance, the family saw an unprecedented opportunity. The systems they had nurtured through centuries of subtle influence were now expanding at a pace no previous era had witnessed. Trade networks evolved into international markets. Local currencies became national standards. Primitive ledgers transformed into structured financial records. And at every stage of this global expansion, the principles the family had embedded long ago were being amplified by new technologies, new governments, and new forms of economic ambition. The hidden architecture they once managed manually was now being replicated at scales that reached far beyond their direct involvement. This transition marked a turning point, not because their influence weakened, but because the world had adopted their logic as a universal framework. Market speculation, once a controlled tactic, became a defining feature of global trade. Debt dependency, originally an engineered vulnerability, turned into the backbone of modern economies. Confidence cycles, once orchestrated by strategic whispers, evolved into worldwide fluctuations, triggered by news, policy announcements, and financial signals. Their playbook had become the world's operating system. Even without direct intervention, the mechanisms they pioneered continued generating the same hierarchies, imbalances, and predictable crises. What emerged was a financial environment where nations competed for stability, institutions fought for credibility, and populations adapted to cycles they believed were simply the nature of economics. Yet beneath the surface, the patterns remained unchanged. Booms inflated by perception, collapses triggered by expectation, recoveries fueled by strategic injections of liquidity, and all of it governed by structures whose roots stretched back to a time when the family first learned how to bend belief into power. The world had modernized, but it had modernized along the lines they had drawn. Even today, the echoes of their influence appear in the way currencies rise and fall, the way markets respond to fear, and the way entire societies depend on systems they do not control and barely understand. Their legacy is not a name etched into monuments, or a dynasty celebrated in history. It is the invisible logic that governs global finance, the unseen architecture guiding nations, and the patterns of manipulation woven so deeply into the fabric of modern life that most people never noticed the design. What began as a quiet experiment centuries before the industrial age evolved into the foundation of the financial world we live in now. If you reach this point of the story, take a moment to share a comment using the phrase, "I saw the pattern," to show you followed this entire journey. And if this exploration of hidden financial structures brought you new insight, consider subscribing so you can keep unraveling these deeper layers with me. Leave a like to help this conversation reach others who are searching for clarity in a world shaped by forces few ever see. And when you are ready, there's another video waiting for you right here on the side that connects directly with what we uncovered today. Click on it and continue discovering how the present is shaped by the shadows of the past.